Also in academia, there does tend to be an issue where if you're focused on a fairly narrow field, you stop, and, well, I use the you just in general.
Right.
Many academics stop really venturing a lot abroad outside their field.
Yeah.
Because in a lot of cases, there's enough within their particular niche that it's, it can be a little bit difficult to branch out, and they get out of the habit of thinking that way.
Definitely. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I was really fascinated by something you were saying about how people are like that one conference, or they couldn't quite grasp the distinction between a dime novel and a pulp magazine.
Yeah.
Something I was very thankful for is that there was a popular movie called Pulp Fiction, if only because it reacquainted
Right.
the general public with the term,
Just the term.
like Pulp Fiction.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember when the Shadow movie came out and it was reviewed in Entertainment Weekly, and they would say stuff like, based on the hero from Radio and Comics, and I'd be there, and even the first Conan movie, here are the comics, and they're like, oh. So, I could kiss Quentin Tarantino, just for making the movie Pulp Fiction.
And I gotta say, in that arena, it's a pretty wide scope of stuff. I mean, some of the stuff that we listened to that weekend, both years, some of it was that was really good. I had never considered that, and some of it was, this is so entry level. Right. That I feel kind of like we could have gone and checked out something else, regardless, for what the things are doing, these guys are getting papers published. A number of the publishers, the academic publishers, are in attendance. Right. These are the guys that not only do the books, but also do the journals and the peer-reviewed journals. We found out something in San Antonio, and that's the Lovecraft Studies group, or anytime you do something regarding H.P. Lovecraft, tends to fill the room. Those guys are active and hungry and chomping at the bit. And there is not a peer-reviewed journal dedicated to Lovecraft studies.
Studies in Weird Fiction is not peer reviewed.
It's not peer reviewed, and what that means is that an academic submitting a paper can get it run in Studies in Weird Fiction, but it doesn't count towards their CV. And when you're required to publish a paper a year, it's important to have that credit. And so our own Darkman is peer reviewed, which is probably about the only thing it's got going for it right now. I say that as being on the board. It's on life support and it needs some serious help. There's been talk in the Pulp Studies group about doing a Pulp Studies journal, right? That provided that it could get peer review, which would do two things. It would bring all of the Lovecraft people over into Pulp Studies, right. Which would increase the audience and readership fivefold, and it would allow the Howard people who are doing criticism a much wider audience to talk to and a much more receptive audience. The Lovecraft people are interested in Howard if for no other reason than he was friends with Lovecraft. And that's cool for them,
Part of the problem with the Darkman, even if it didn't have some of the issues it has, even if it was an excellent journal with top-notch stuff, great review, everything, it's still going to be 75 people reading it, and we're all and preaching to the choir.
Right.
Right. If you broaden, the scope, then you're getting the message out to people, beyond just Howard fans that probably already know it, and all it is doing is refining their own knowledge,
And this is something that I've suspected for a long time, and thankfully, we were initially bummed that Jeff got bumped into the Western Studies section, but I think it actually was probably the best thing.
Once you thought about it, I realized, let's get it out there.
We got to take Howard to places that he's not going to be,
And you know what? They loved it.
Yeah, they did. They were
loved it.
excited
They're
about
like,
it. It was
oh man,
something
you got to get in
new.
our
They
book.
hadn't heard
You know,
of it.
so now Mark and I are going to be co-authoring an article on Howard's Weird Westerns to go in. It'll probably be the first one in that volume.
And you guys will all read it and go, this is nothing we don't know.
That's right, because it'll be very introductory.
But other people are going to read it and go, oh my
That's right.
God, I got to go find this
That's right.
this vampire story. Yes, sir.
He wrote a historical fiction set in the Crusade era.
Oh,
Would that
yes.
not also open another branch?
he wrote many.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Historical fiction, absolutely.
Uh,
But people also, when you guys are talking about this, they look at a lot of the fiction stuff and say Tarzan. That's
Right.
all they say for Burroughs, even though he had John
Right.
Carter, Laduciar, Venus,
That's right.
the Moon. Howard had the same type of worlds in the sense that he expanded out, but
Yeah.
I think they also look at, he only wrote so many stories.
Right.
And they stopped, because he's, in some people's opinion, a short-term author versus somebody who had countless series, countless books that have become movies throughout the 70s with, can't remember the actor's name, but I'm pretty sure he was in every adaptation of Burroughs' books.
Troy McClure.
Doug McClure.
Also with the movies.
The
that
guy
are
that
coming
the guy
out
when they
now
couldn't get James
with-
Franciscus.
with the John Carter movie out, the Conan movie, wouldn't that help generate more interest back into the genres?
Yeah, yes and no. Yes. There's next week I'll be at SoonerCon, and there's a panel that I'm not on inexplicably called Conan and John Carter. Everything old is new again. The sudden resurgence of heroic fantasy. So you know, it's these things go in cycles. You know, and the fact that both of those movies came out and didn't do well critically, even if commercially they might have made their money back. All they do is they kind of they keep the name in the consciousness, but without somebody to contextualize it, you know, and say, well, like everything Hollywood does, they messed up the execution, you know, or you know, to hand somebody a Conan book and go, that wasn't the Conan that's in the books. Here's the stuff you want to read. You know, you gotta have that with it as well. Otherwise, you know, because the end result is if you don't have people who are critically talking or even just coming, you know, and speaking to fans. Every year we get fans here in Cross Plains who, you know, there's always somebody who goes, he wrote boxing stories? Yeah. You know, so it talking about it and kind of letting people know what you're into is, I think that's huge. You gotta do that, even if it's, you know, you don't have to be an academic or interested in contributing academic papers to further that knowledge, you know.
Right. Well, and you know that's why I think there's a place not just for you know real hardcore academic work on Howard, but also the fan scholarship. That's important too. You know, it's important to have places like Two Gun Raconteur and The Dark Man
And Ray Hoopa.
You know, although Ray Hoopa is more the sausage making, you know, to some degree, but you know that's important too. There's this, you know, this is kind of an interesting thing with Howard fandom. This dichotomy between you know academic work on Howard and the fan world of Howard, and you know we talk here even you know there's a disconnect often between the two. Sometimes it's a very conscious disconnect, and you know, we talk even the title of this, you know, this symposium, Storming the Gates of Academia. You know, there's always this contentious language that we use even to frame academic work when it comes to Howard, and a lot of that, you know, comes to there's an ingrained hostility, I think, between people that in fandom that have been trying to do, you know, really and are doing and have done really good work, and the academic world, which has often, as you know, turned its nose up, you know, at Howard's work, and you know, so I think you know a lot of it's rooted in probably in that period in the '80s where you first really trying to breach that and were rejected, you know.
It's changed,
It's
though.
changed.
Yeah.
You know, it's
Yeah.
different there. That gate doesn't need to be stormed so much. It's really open, you know, if you want to walk in. But you know, part of the problem, you know, if we want to get Howard into the academic world and have you know annotated volume of Conan stories being taught in a science fiction and fantasy course in an undergraduate college English class alongside Tolkien and Lovecraft and whoever, we've got to take it to them. They're not going to come to us and ask for it. And if we're going to them, it's like going to another country. You show up in a foreign country and you're like, hey, doesn't anybody speak English here? You're not going to get, people are going to look, but if you try to speak their language, even if you don't do it well, but you try and make that effort, they'll be receptive to you. So we need to try and do a better job of understanding academic language. I've seen these incredible arguments over, oh, you can't use footnotes, that's horrible, nobody likes that, that's boring, that's what, really? It's simple things like that may seem bizarre to people who aren't used to academic writing, but you need to learn that language, and you need, if we want to be taken seriously, that's
Yeah,
part of it.
It's the difference between getting published and not getting
And
published.
not getting published.
Yeah.
And I think you gotta put up the pitchforks and torches.
Yes.
When you see ideas you don't like too.
That's right.
I wanna-
Now that's a great point.
I want to read you. This is the first draft of the pitch. This is the thing that Jeff and I are working on together, and I want you to hear the kind of language that we're needing to put into this as an abstract for consideration in the book. This is Vaqueros and Vampires in the Pulps, Robert E. Howard and the Genesis of the Weird Western Tale. The 1932 short story, The Horror from the Mound by pulp writer Robert E. Howard, is often described anecdotally as the first true work of weird Western fiction. While this claim of primacy is perhaps debatable, the significant influence that Horror from the Mound and Howard's other Depression-era weird Western tales have had on modern authors such as Joe R. Lansdale, Stephen King, and Ed M. Erdelak is well documented. This article will utilize a contextual approach in analyzing The Horror from the Mound, as well as other stories by Howard that can be classified as weird westerns, in order to better elucidate the cultural, economic, and biographical factors that led Howard to proactively engage in this early example of genre hybridity. I'll stop there, but the thing,
I filled it with as much jargon as I could.
but we send that to them, and they're going to be like, oh, genre hybridity.
You laugh.
It's like
but-
an incantation. They're like, oh, clearly we're going for a treat. And I think we're going to talk about the letter that showed up in Weird Tales after The Horror from the Mound was published.
Absolutely, we
wherein
will.
the guy complained that clearly he doesn't understand the rules of vampires.
Yeah.
So it's we're gonna do what we do, and the difference is really gonna be footnotes.
To some
Honestly.
degree, yes, and sprinkling liberal doses of jargon like that, because you've got to use their language,
Yep.
But that's a big part of it. But Rusty makes a great point, and let's as Howard is going to be put under the microscope of real criticism, not fan criticism, because fan criticism by its very nature is not objective, by definition. We're all fans here, and we have a hard time saying anything negative about Howard, because we love this stuff. Even if we know it, we don't want to tell anybody else about it. You know what I mean? Now, when Howard is out there, he's going to be out there warts and all, and we've got to accept that.
It's gonna, yeah.
People are gonna do write papers about all sorts of subjects that are going to make us as fans uncomfortable.
But other people are going to then write an article that refutes that article.
That's right, and that's the way it works. And we have to be accepted, and we have to not engage in ad hominem attacks, which is something that we often do as quote defenders of the shield wall. Is that we've used that. It's time to maybe bring down the shield wall. We don't need it anymore. We've won. Howard's out there. The pure texts are out there. He can stand on his own. He doesn't need defending so much anymore. Now, when facts are wrong, you're there to correct them. I'm sorry?
It's hard to hear.
Oh, I'm
and
sorry.
we couldn't hear what
Absolutely.
Rusty said. Would you repeat?
All right, we're on the mic.
Sure. Can you hear me now?
That's much better.
Okay. Rusty made the point that we've also got to put away the pitchforks, I think was the phrase he used when people say critical things about Howard and Howard's work. And he's absolutely right. As Howard is put out there under the microscope in the critical world, people are going to say things in analyzing his works that we may not like. And we have to accept that, and if there are facts that need to be corrected, you refute it. But we can't go on the attack attacking the messenger when that sort of thing happens. That's the way it works. That's the way scholarship works. And so I think that's a really important point that Rusty makes. We often get so defensive sometimes, and there's reason for that. There's a lot of history, that's caused this defensiveness. But we need to let it go now. We've won. We really have. Pure Howard is out there in droves. It's out there, and it's not going away now that it's there.
Yeah,
And-
the inertia will take care of itself. I mean, there's an inertial buildup on this that, other people will bring that into question. Other, counter papers will be written. And that's how it's kind of done in academia. I still owe Jeffrey Cahan a paper on the boxing stories because he's never been more wrong in his life. But but you do it with a paper. You don't say, Jeff, you're an imbecile. And so that's kind of the. I think that's where we are. If we want to decide to do this, and I'm all for it because I think it's going to ultimately help us. There is one of the projects that's being worked on. Justin and Deidre's book is still a going concern. One of the other projects that's being worked on actually has Jeff and Frank Kaufman, a fellow professor, an academic, and it's a Howard book intended for use in a college classroom.
Right. It's Conan specific. It's called Conan Meets the Academy. It's put out by McFarland Press, who is one of the leading scholarly publishers on popular culture studies.
And do you know what a big deal and what a cool thing that would be to have somebody, even if it's just in one university, even if it's just over at Bowling Green or wherever, doing a course on Conan?
Right.
Who wouldn't want 3 hours
Right.
of English literature credit to read
Right.
and talk about Conan?
Right.
That's awesome.
And the book is Conan as a popular culture figure. So it begins with Howard's Conan, and then it goes all the way through modern Conan with the movies and the video games and things like that. And McFarland is a huge publisher. A book, put out by a publisher like that, it's going to be in the catalogs that university libraries use to order their books. So they see these things, they're going to be checking off the list. It's not going to be something, 200 copies put out by the foundation that we all read, but again, preaching to the choir, it's going to be out there in university libraries. And that's the benefit of moving Howard into the academic world and getting into these academic publishers. It gets him out there to a broader audience. It gets critical work on Howard into the hands of grad students who can't afford to buy, a $75 signed edition of Blood and Thunder by Mark Fenn. That's. They can go to the library and check it out, at their university and do a paper on it. One of the guys, the two of the guys that came back to both years, these last 2 years that we were there. One of them, Daniel Nikos, is working on his doctoral dissertation, and he's doing it on Howard. The other one, Jonathan Hellard, just defended his master's thesis on C.L. Moore and gender studies in C.L. Moore's work. I was just reading it. It's magnificent. It's wonderful. It's full of jargony stuff like what we're talking about. But this is great. I mean, it's accepted now.
Yeah.
But you get it out there, and it's getting it beyond just us. And getting it out there in the world. And the idea that there's grad students out there doing papers on Howard and C.L. Moore and Lovecraft. To me, that's a good thing. Not everyone, I think, in Howard fandom agrees. A lot of people have a lot of disdain for academia, and they, couldn't care less if Howard is being taught in university classes. But I think it's a great thing, personally.
Charles, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, I find all this personally very gratifying. I mean, as Howard himself said, I was the first writer of the Post-Oaks Country. I was totally in a totally different environment that in no way nurtured art, literature, and culture. Like when I was starting out, I was one of the original barbarians, storming the gates. Whether I did it well or poorly, it's just there was no one else to do it. And I was coming from a background like Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, the people, which, you know, I have deep roots there and I love it a lot. But I was just, you know, the people there are very, they're just like a lot of, like, we were surrounded by like a lot of plodding, you know, unimaginative adults.
Blue collar guys, yeah.
Yeah, blue collar guys, like especially like, you know, back then, if you met someone like, you know, like, hey, I like that movie Star Wars, you'd be like, oh, my brother. Yeah, you know, and whereas like, you know, a few years later, you move to someplace like New York, and you love the story like the Black God's Kiss, you can join the Black God's Kiss Club. You know, it's like just like a totally different sort of environment. So Howard Studies is a good thing to have, like, approached from you know, like different directions. And I do think, like, even like, I mean, you know, Mark and I, we're like rank amateurs, and we still managed to accomplish something. And even though we have like real academics getting into it, I still think like, you know, like undergraduates or people with like little in the way of formal education still may have something to offer, if only in the sense of bringing like a different perspective,
Right.
like a blue collar perspective or whatever. You know, that's you know, like you know, and we see that in like Lovecraft studies. You know, like S.T. Joshi, you know, a friend of mine, he was always sort of like bothered. He said, like, you know, Lovecraft is read by the wrong people. Well, you know, who are the right people? Like,
Right.
yeah, I mean, I'd rather have my stories read by some cute goth chick than some, you know, dried up mummy, you know. and but the thing is, like, about, you know, the punks and the goths and, like, you know, people like that, you know, like, you know, like, you know, some of them are class twit. I mean, God's in his heaven, you know, all's right in their world, but those kids, you know, they've looked in the Necronomicon,
Yeah, yeah.
you know, and, you know, they you know, they grasp it more, and like I told ST, you're kind of like casting your pearls before swine. You have like, you know, one environment where like Lovecraft is an icon, and another where he's like going to be like tolerated at best.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, yeah, I absolutely agree, and you know, it's 10 years ago I would have said we need to study everything, not just Conan, and now I kind of don't care. You know, as long as we're talking about Howard, and as long as you've got something interesting to say, or you know, even if it's a simple thought, you know, it might lead, it may lead us to another thought, and that's absolutely valid. You know, I think Joshie missed the boat because he used to disparage a lot of the mythos stories in favor of the Dreamland stuff, and you know, you cannot deny the pop cultural ubiquity of Cthulhu. You know, I mean, that's a level of public consciousness the likes of which I've never seen in a horror concept.
I keep getting Facebook ads for plush Cthulhu dolls popping up. I don't know, maybe I'm friending the wrong people or something, but you know.
We've got about 10 minutes left. Are there any questions?
I have kind of a funny question about the history of this. I remember, it's a little bit of a Rip Van Winkle question. I remember back in the 60s and early 70s when Jules Feiffer wrote All in Color for a Dime.
Yeah.
Stan Lee started going to college campuses promoting Marvel Comics and was received and was written up in the New York Times.
Right.
And then the Tolkien books came out in Ballantine editions, and then Ballantine started publishing Lord Dunsany, everything fantasy, almost going back in time and doing. And what happened? And that seemed to be a momentum towards academic acceptance in the early to mid 70s. And I was out of fandom or anything else from then on for a long time.
Right.
What happened?
Well,
What
you know,
happened with that momentum?
part of, you know, the one guy was, you know, one of my friends I was talking about, Richard Olson, who, you know, he's got articles all the time in the beginning of Overstreet and all of those. He's a PhD in psychology, but also does popular culture stuff on the side. That was, you know, when he first helped start PCA in the early 70s, it was a part of that movement. And, I think it just waned You know, you talk about this happening going in cycles. You know, the pendulum just kind of swung back the other way, I guess, maybe, you know, at a certain point. But, you know, you're right, there was this momentum early on. And I love All in Color for a Dime, by the way. But, you know, it's come back now. It's come back much stronger. You know, I think there was that effort, and I just think it fizzled, and there was an acceptance. I think today there is a much more of a recognition that popular culture is important. You know, because you know, especially, you know, for me, coming from an anthropological background. Okay, if you want to study a culture, you know, we move beyond studying elite culture. You know, 50 years ago, 75 years ago, we want to learn about real people. You know, I'm not out there excavating, you know, throne rooms. You know, I'm out there digging through regular people's garbage, you know, that lived 1,000 years ago or 1,500 years ago. That's what tells you about real people. Popular culture tells you about real people. You know, to me, pulps themselves are cultural artifacts. You know, most people weren't reading Fitzgerald, you know, in the, you know, the 1920s. They were reading, you know, Black Mask. You know,
Yeah.
that's what more people were reading. You know, so if you look at the ads in Black Mask, that's going to tell you more about the people that were living in that time, that context. You know, so there is now a recognition that popular culture is not just worthy of study, but is necessary to be studied if you really want to understand a society. It's critical.
Can I add, a
Absolutely.
lot of the momentum was dissipated by the appearance of all these pastiches.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The Tolkien imitators
Right.
and all those.
Right.
things, yeah.
Yeah, that was I was
Saturation.
going to bring
Yeah,
that up. Morgan
oversaturation.
Holmes, makes
Right.
the case that in the case of, say, Howard, there was all this Howard material that got published, but then when the Howard material ran out, people started putting things on the book in the style of Conan,
Right.
similar to the guy who brought you Conan, by the painter of the book covers of Conan, you know, and each, you know, successful, you know, like people will only buy one terrible novel and go, "Ugh, no more of this." And so, you know, the same. It was the same thing with the movies. You know, the Conan the Barbarian came out, and then all of a sudden, Miles O'Keefe is in Ator the Fighting Eagle, and no one asked for that. No one asked for that, you know. And so I think, you know, saturation, inundation. The same thing happened with Tolkien. I mean, and high fantasy Tolkien pastiches are still on the bookshelves to this day. That's what basically got me out of reading most of that fantasy style stuff, because I'd pick it up and I'd get 10 pages in, and here's the things that are half the size of a man, and I'm like, well, I wonder what he's going to end up doing with the ring, you know. And they were unapologetic about it, you know. I was so fascinated with the Tolkien elves that I wanted to do my take on them. Yoy, you know. So I think that's what happened.
Oversaturation. We have any
So, kind of mentioned you know, the Black Mask and the writers that came out of that. A lot of them ended up with a lot more critical and popular acclaim. Is there any key factor that you would call out as to why Dashiell Hammett, Raymond Chandler get the attention, guys like Lovecraft, Howard, and the other Weird Tales writers do not?
They got into books earlier.
Yeah.
They made the leap into hardcover detective novels 10 to 15 years before the paperbacks came out.
Mystery's also been much more popular than fantasy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, a lot more successful in that regard. And they
It's not speculative fiction, which has that stigma.
it should be noted that even as Chandler was publishing The Big Sleep in 34, 33, the Black Mask
39.
the Black Mask guys were razzing him about it. Now he's gone highbrow. He's not down here with the rest of us.
I'm just going to add, well, you know, of course the movies helped. I mean, it's easy
Right,
to make a
right,
mystery
right.
movie than
That's
it
a
is
great
special
point.
effects movie, especially back
Right.
in the 30s. The special effects would look corny and cheesy.
Yeah.
you know, but
Yeah.
nowadays with, you know, CGI, I mean, science fiction movies, and superheroes.
That's a
are,
great point.
So by the time
$3 million
those,
billion
by the time those Del Matbat novels were published in the 1940s, there was already an audience that grew up reading Chandler and Hammett, and so you know, I think they got that push a lot sooner. Yes, ma'am.
I'd also suspect that the Weird Tales guys didn't get the kind of boost that say the futurists in New York and the harder science fiction writers got from people like Gernsback, John Campbell, you know, the
It's-
kind of people that
yeah.
really started making,
Right.
or Julie Schwartz, the kind of people that really started making speculative fiction more acceptable in the mainstream.
SF fandom organized early.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And they had the advantage of organizing in New York City where the publishing was. Weird Tales was, you know, that group, the Lovecraft Circle, was spread all across the country. And when Howard died and then Lovecraft died a year later, the circle broke up, you know, as a literary brotherhood.
Smith retired effectively
Yeah,
the
Smith,
following year.
Yeah, Smith said, I'm done. And so, you know, by the time that all that was going on, science fiction fans were gathering at annual conventions. So it was a different dynamic, to be sure. And having a concerted group who could get into the magazines and you know, get an occasional review printed in a New York paper made a difference, definitely. Anything you want to add to that? Are we good? What else, folks? Anything?
We'll get organized one day.
Yeah. Hey, real quick, let me say, because we're going to run out of.
Yeah, you are me.
Real quick. Real quick, I just want to say, because we're going to run out of time here in a minute. I had found a whole bunch of leftover copies of my paper from the 2011 PCA, so if anybody wants one, please take them. I hate to just throw them away, you know, after this is over. But let's. We probably have time at least for one or two more questions. Is anyone? Yes.
With the resurgence through Dark Horse of the Conan comics, the Solomon Kane, the Call, do you guys see that helping move Howard back into the mainstream, or is it going to flounder again like it did with Marvel's run it right into the ground in the 80s? You know, 500 some issues of a comic book that are great to read, but it seemed like they started repeating the same story over and over
Right.
monthly.
Oh, I think Mark will probably have a lot to say about this. Real quick, in my opinion, we're both.
Well, I have
involved.
something,
Go
like
for it.
that. I don't think it will have the same impact it did in the 70s because, you know, like, you know, comics cost too damn much. You know, $4 for a comic book, I mean,
Yeah.
you know, I can't buy them, you know, like, you know, 10 issues for, you know, I mean, $10 for an issue of, like, Famous Monsters. You know, so it's, you know, like a very, you know, like, it's a much more narrow people who can afford to, you know, get into these things.
Yeah, what Dark Horse is doing is not only they're publishing the new stuff, but they're also publishing the old stuff. And so that actually kind of does them double, they kind of get to double dip in that regard. And with the kind of demise of the monthly comic giving rise to the graphic novel and the trade paperback and the collections, you know, that helps their, what they call footprint on the bookshelf. So I think that the difference is that, you know, in the 70s and early 80s, you had exponentially more people reading those Conan comics than you do now. The audience for the monthly stuff has shrunk, even as the sales for graphic novels are going through the roof. I think actually what probably did more to sort of popularize, or not popularize, but, you know, because it's all pieces and parts of a big mosaic. I think the Age of Conan massively multiplayer game did more to kind of bring up some brand awareness because 4 months after it launched, Sheldon dropped the reference on the Big Bang Theory, and they had a whole episode
Right.
based around him and Penny playing Age of Conan. That's huge. I mean, that's bigger than all the comic sales put together, you know? So, yes, last one.
Well, just to add on that to a point, you know, it's really interesting to me, like when Dazzler #1 came out in the 70s, just this offshoot of an X-Men character, it sold 1 million copies.
Right.
Right now, Grant Morrison, who's writing, you know, Batman Incorporated, which is DC's highest selling book, sold, and not 1 million copies, they were happy to sell 60,000.
Right.
And so, I mean, that's, you know, to talk about how the comic book footprint has diminished in terms of, even, especially with Conan, even though Brian Wood's work on the new Conan stuff is spectacular.
Yeah, and you know, the thing is you got to add into that where the sales continue to climb in huge leaps and bounds is in the graphic novels.
Yeah.
Bookstores, you know, those sales have not gone away so much as they've migrated out of the Android's dungeon and into Barnes and Noble, for lack of a better description for them. All right, last one, Ed, all the way in the back.
Yep. In terms of academics and regionalism, is there any region in the United States that is more, favorable for Howard than another one, like say the Southwest as opposed to Northeast? I know Jeff's from Florida, you're from Texas, Charles is from New York. Is there anyone that's more favorable?
I don't think it really matters if you're going to go to those regional shows. I mean,
In terms of academics?
Yeah. Clearly, I think you'll get more traction at the Southwestern Regional Conference if you do the Howard was a Texas writer angle, right? I mean, if you do that in the Northeast, nobody's going to care. But I mean, aside from that, if you're just doing a Conan paper, region doesn't matter. And in fact, I'd almost say, for something like that, you really almost want to save it for the national conference, which is in Washington, D.C. next year. Those of you in the Washington, D.C. area are certainly encouraged to participate, or at least take me and Jeff out and get us a steak and some Jameson. So, guys, thank you very much for coming to this. I know many of you struggled with the late night festivities last night, so we really appreciate you showing up, even those of you that staggered in late. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of the day.